it's a really poetic, romantic, surreal experience that you guys created, and there's such a blend of devices and tools and styles that have really come together for this. And I'm curious, when you read the script, how did you kind of come up with all these things? You know, you've got elements like you've got these romantic zooms, you've got spotlights in the day, you've got the slow motion work. You've got such a blend of things, and it's obviously not just like one thing that you can look at and say, all right, I'm inspired by this. This is the direction we want to go, and it's all these things put together. So take me through what that process was like.
Yeah, I mean, it was a fun process with Joe. I mean, Joe is such a dreamer and he's such a romantic and he has such a deep connection to the story and the characters and the people in the city. So it was really fun. And I think, you know, one thing that's really important to consider, you know, you talk about taking big swings, you know, I can't just walk into a project and start swinging. You know, that's not really how things work. It's you find people that you believe in and that you inspire you and that trust you and that you trust them. And you kind of constantly push each other, you know, and I feel like all of my best collaborations have been situations where the director, the actors, the production designer, everyone is just pushing each other to deliver something different that we've never seen before. So I think that's something that's really important to consider. I think it's you have to be really receptive to the energy of the people that you're collaborating with, and I think that's sort of an art that I'm constantly trying to get better at and to learn. And with Last Black Man, you know, it was a mix of interpreting Joe's vision, my own vision, and then also dealing with the realities of making like a very low budget indie film on a very tight schedule. So it was about finding like the right small tool set that worked for us and then just making it all that it could be. And it was kind of it was an exploration. You know, Joe and I talked a lot before we shot, but I only had a couple weeks to prep the movie, so we really didn't have a lot of time. Like we didn't even, you know, we didn't shot list every single scene before we shot. You know, a lot of it was figuring it out as we were rehearsing. But you know, we floated a lot of different references by each other that we liked, and we kind of figured out what stuck. And then there were moments on set where we would just experiment with something and like it, and then embrace it and kind of move on with it throughout the show. You know, for example, like the spotlight, like the front lighting, the spotlight effect, that wasn't something that was super well planned. It was something that kind of happened on the first day. We were playing around a little bit and it looked good. And Joe kind of freaked out when he saw it and loved it. He was like, that's the movie. I want that. And so we kind of just went for it. And we carried it through the rest of the film. That was sort of terrifying because I didn't know if I could keep that consistency throughout the film. But, you know, we did our best, and my gaffer Tej did an amazing job doing that. And then, yeah, I mean, it was a mix of, you know, those like that kind of like romantic, nostalgic feel, and then also trying to inject something modern into this story.
Right. So with the spotlight, for example, you said that you kind of just created it and tested it out, and it just like you went with it. What was that? What were you trying to evoke with that specifically that allowed you to say, all right, this is something that I can carry on throughout?
I think part of it for Joe, I mean, you know, for both of us, it was something we had never seen recently. You know, it was sort of like, I think what it did was it immediately gave us this nostalgic feeling of films we've seen in the past that we love. And it was very romantic. And, you know, it pops the characters out in this very surreal way that I think is actually really important to the story, because it's about elevating these kind of everyday characters that are, you know, oppressed in a lot of ways and really struggling, but they're these really beautiful people with a vision and hope and dream. And you want to like elevate that and make it romantic and elegant and imaginative. And I think it was kind of an instant way. Like when we saw it, it just had such a visceral feeling to it that we couldn't help but just keep doing it, you know, because it really just pops these characters out of these environments in such a special way.
Yeah. What's the work you have to do then moving forward to kind of maintain that thread and have some sort of consistency in the language that you're building throughout?
Yeah, I mean, it was something that was definitely tricky, and we'd often completely light a scene, and then at the last minute we would bring in our sort of frontal key light, which was often just right over the camera. And if we were shooting an interior, you know, it would be a light. If we were shooting an exterior, sometimes we would use a big 18K HMI, or we would just use a mirror board through like very light diffusion. But it got to a point where our crew just kind of knew that was coming, and so they would have a few tools on standby ready to do it. And it was also it's challenging because, you know, not only the lighting but the composition was very aggressive in terms of like very frontal, very on eye line. A lot of times the actors couldn't see the people they were speaking to. A lot of times the camera was very close to them with a light directly over the matte box shining directly in their eyes. And a lot of these people, a lot of our cast had never acted before or only acted a few times. So it was a big challenge, and it took a lot of trust from them to understand that we were doing something that was right for the film. And that goes back to that idea of trust. It's like, you can come in and have a lot of great ideas and do something really aggressive, but if everyone's not on board and if everyone doesn't understand it, then it becomes really problematic. So I think, you know, it was about creating this sort of group trust that what we were doing, there was a vision to what we were doing, and that it was going to become greater than the sum of its parts, you know?
Right. Gotcha. You know, you talked about kind of finding collaborators that you can trust and build that relationship with. How much of that has kind of changed for you over the course of the years as your career has kind of gone on? And what's that like when you came out of film school? Did you have that luxury of saying, all right, here are the people that I know that I want to work with, rather than kind of taking everything that came your way?
No, I mean, in film school, I was shooting everything I could possibly get my hands on. And I think I was working with all different types of people, and really just experimenting. One, because I wanted the experience and I wanted to experiment, and the other because I was flat broke and I didn't have any any other crew skills, so I couldn't like go and work as an electric or a grip or an AC. You know, I just had to kind of go out there and make money as a DP however I could. So, you know, I learned a lot in doing that on how to manage relationships with directors and producers and other people, and also I started to discover the types of energies I like to be around. And that's a blessing and a curse a little bit. I found myself at a weird point in my career shortly after college. I found myself sort of gravitating towards certain energies and certain people that I got along with and that liked my ideas, and then I could just kind of come on set and they would let me do my thing. And I thought that was really cool. And then after a couple of years, I was like, my work isn't really evolving and it's not that interesting. And like, I'm just kind of doing my thing. And that was kind of a turning point for me, where I realized I needed to start getting myself into situations that were more challenging and with directors that were going to push me and maybe disagree with me. And it also, I think a big part of it was just made me listen more. You know, I think especially as DPs, we spend so much time on set. We spend a lot more time on set than directors do, for example. So a lot of times, you know, as young DPs, we come on the set having way more experience and knowledge about how things run technically. So we're like, oh no, it's better this way. Trust me. Like, you're going to like this better if we do the shot like this, and it's going to work better for lighting and for schedule. And so you kind of end up just railroading the director, you know, and I was very guilty of that as a young DP. And, you know, I still have to be careful of that, you know, when you're working with a director, you really need to respect their vision. And even if you don't completely understand it, or it doesn't make sense, or it seems ridiculous, there's a reason why you're there making their project, and it's your responsibility to honor that. And that was something I really learned with Joe, because Joe is an incredible talent. He's a genius. He didn't have as much experience with me as me on set, and he was very open about that. And, you know, I'm really glad I met him when I did, and that I was really open to his ideas and really willing to listen, because I would spend the extra time to try to interpret his ideas instead of just saying, no, that's not going to work, you know, because there are so many scenes in the movie that are so ridiculous and so crazy, and that I don't even know how we pulled them off, that were Joe's idea and that he pushed to do. And if I had gone for the easier option and said, oh, this is easier for production, it's cheaper, we would have made a mediocre film and we wouldn't be here right now talking about it, you know? So I think it's really important to find people that push you, and then push you in ways that are really like that exciting for you. Yeah.
Can you talk about the tonality of the film a little bit? I mean, obviously you've got these characters that are like I mentioned, this like heightened reality, even in their performances. Obviously the story, while it's rooted in something that's extremely relevant and real, it does have that surreal aspect to it, not only visually, but also in the tones of the way the characters speak and how they act. So how did you work with that on set?
Yeah, I mean, the tone is really a tribute to Joe. And I don't know how exactly we got there because you don't always see it on set. You know, that's the funny thing about shooting a film is that there's so much going on set, and you just hope that the tone and the vibe of the movie is still there. And I think a big part of it was how we directed the performances, and the other big part was how we captured them. And I think for me, the tone is sort of this crossbreed of something very nostalgic and romantic, but also something very modern and very timely. And it's funny and it's dramatic and it's thrilling. It's a little bit of everything, which I really love about it. It's not one thing. And that's kind of the last monologue of the film is, Montgomery telling Jimmy, "You are not one thing." And I think that, that kind of it sums up the tone of the film is that, especially now things are so complicated that we need to accept that life is very multifaceted. And so, there's moments of humor, there's moments of drama. And I think we always wanted to toe the line between them and just make it something that resonated and felt very intimate.
Right. Can you talk about the lensing a little bit? Obviously, also with respect to aspect ratio, I know you think you show 1:6:6, and I think it was very conducive for a lot of what I would call like portraiture within the film. So can you talk about the decision there?
Yeah. A lot of our references for this film were photographic. We definitely referenced other filmmakers and other films, but when I was reading the script and we were talking about it, a lot of photography came to mind. And also having spent time in San Francisco and spending more time during prep, I just spent a lot of time walking around with my rangefinder camera taking pictures. And the way I photograph is pretty much always with a rangefinder, which means I'm using one lens. And instead of switching lenses to get a different shot, I'm just moving my body physically to get to the place I want to be. And so I really enjoy working with one lens, and I get really intimate with a certain focal length, and I know how it makes people feel in different situations. And so for us, I think we wanted to have this sort of discipline of like only using a couple lenses for the most part. So we really we pretty much use the 27 millimeter for every single shot of the movie. When we were inside the house, we used the 14 millimeter, I think, a bit, and then we obviously used the zoom. But, I really made it a challenge to myself to, only use one lens as much as possible. It got to the point where, I wasn't really calling for lenses. The ACs just kind of knew if this was going to be a 27 millimeter or 14 millimeter shot, and they would just put it on the camera because they knew. And that was also really fun because everyone was just really in sync. But yeah, I think it was really important. The idea of portraiture was really important, as I wanted to elevate these characters because these are characters that are often sort of suppressed in popular culture. And also, I really just wanted to romanticize them because I think if we don't love these people in this film, we're not going to care about their story. That was so important to me, is that we really just instantly connect with them. And I think that did it. And I think having the boxier aspect ratio, the 1:6:6, was really important too, because it does make it more photographic, and it pushed me in my compositions a certain way. Having that verticality, really works well with close-ups, and it also works well with these tall vertical landscapes in San Francisco.
Yeah. The film is about, right, like it's about the displacement of this guy from his childhood home, and more broadly about the displacement of African Americans in San Francisco and the gentrification that's happening there. Can you talk about how like that wide angle field of view, how it brings in the relationship between character and place, and how that was part of that vision maybe?
You just want to talk about how wide angle lenses were.
Yeah, because it's not simply there's a relationship that you're building between the location as well as the character.
Totally. Yeah, I love using wider lenses just because it forces you to get closer to the people and the places, and it also just feels more immersive. When you're on a wider lens, you really feel the spaces wrap around you, which I love. And we kind of assigned the 14 millimeter lens to the interior of the house because we wanted to have that grand feel. And I tried to avoid using that lens too much outside of the house, so that every time you were inside the house, you really felt a special feeling that you maybe couldn't put your finger on. I always use the analogy, like, if my mom can't tell, so it's like the things that, like, maybe a technician or a DP could tell, like, oh, he's using wider lenses. Like, I
Right.
know, but like, it's the idea of the subconscious that, like, my mom could tell there's something different, but she couldn't necessarily tell me exactly what it is. So it's like, it's about using those subconscious tools. But yeah, so we would use a 14 millimeter inside the house. And I tried to avoid using that for too many close-ups, because I feel like it really distorts people's faces in a way that's
Totally.
like just not flattering. And I feel like it's been done a lot recently. The 27 millimeter is a great lens because you can get really close to someone and it feels very intimate, and it's still kind of wide, but it doesn't have the distortion that a lot of other lenses have. But yeah, in general, I love the wide lenses because it's just so much more visceral and human and intimate.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw a couple interviews where you talked about how Kaurismäki was a big reference for you guys, and I
Mm-hmm.
remember he had a quote one time where he talked about how you know uh, even if you're serious as your story, you shouldn't forget humor, and that he always brings humor into his work because he feels like life is intolerable without humor. And I know that
Mm-hmm.
in some of the ways that you captured like the group of friends outside of Mont's home, with that kind of deadpan aesthetic that Kaurismäki was kind of famous for. What was that? What was that kind of process like, and where did you kind of bring that humor in?
Yeah, I mean, again, a lot of the humor I credit to Joe and the actors, and Rob, the writer, the co-writer, uh, and they just created such an amazing vibe on set, and it was great to just have all these different San Franciscans come on to set. And for me, it was, that's another thing as a DP that's a huge challenge, which I really faced on this film, is that we had a lot of non-actors. I was in a place I had never worked before with a crew that I was familiar with, but still getting to know as we were shooting. And I'm a perfectionist and I work really hard, and I have a very specific idea of how I want projects to look and feel. Um, but at the same time, you have to remember that you're amongst a huge group of people with a very important energy flow going. And, I had to be very careful not to impose too much on the situation. You have these amazing, like, ensemble tableau shots of, the entire group of guys that hang out in front of their house. And, we had more complicated shots designed, and very quickly we realized that they weren't necessarily going to hit their marks, or, if they did hit they were very capable of hitting their marks, but if they did, it killed their performance. So we had to be
Right.
very respectful and very careful of how we photograph them. So what happened was I really started to lean towards just very, like, simple tableau shots, and instead of doing a lot of complicated camera movement, it was like, what is the most interesting and, like, striking first impression I can give the audience? And if I can start with that first impression that's really strong, I know that their performances will carry it the rest of the way. And
Yeah.
that was kind of a sentiment and it's, again, that goes back to that photographic feel, that every time you see a frame, you're like, whoa, okay, this feels different. This feels weird. But I know exactly what I'm looking at. And then I kind of, by doing that, I'm able then to just kind of hand it off to the performers and let them do their work. And I'm not doing a crazy camera move. I've just set up a really nice tableau shot for them to live in and to explore.
Right. Um, you also have this beautiful warmth that's kind of there, consistent throughout the film. And I saw where Joe talked about how, ironically, like, some of the places that you guys shot and don't exist anymore, and that
Mm-hmm.
in some ways the film is kind of period without it intending to be period. And of course, the palette in itself is actually kind of what a lot of people would instinctively maybe go towards as a period palette. So what was
Mm-hmm.
that? Was there anything that was intentional there with regards to keeping things kind of timeless?
Yeah, I mean, timeless is a word that I think we used a lot. And it's funny because as much as we wanted it to be timeless, it was a very pressing story that needed to be told right at that moment. And, that's something we talked about a lot. And there were many times during the shoot where we were like, we have to shoot at this location tomorrow, even though it's on our schedule for 3 weeks from now, because if we don't do it, it's going to be gone. And
Wow.
I mean, you go back to, there are a number of locations in that film, like iconic locations, especially like Montgomery's grandfather's house, the one that's right by the water. we tried to go and do pickups there at the end of the shoot, and they had built buildings on either side of that house, and it's impossible to shoot there anymore. And they built a huge fence where that sidewalk is that has the view of the water. So there's it was really like, it was a very pressing story. And I think palette wise, I tried not to force anything. And again, it was one of those situations where we didn't have a lot of time. We didn't have a lot of money. We couldn't like completely redesign any spaces. So it was always more of a subtractive process of figuring out what colors work for us, what works within our palette, and then try to avoid colors outside of that. And one thing I do that I think is really important is create a very like strong show LUT. And so I worked with my colorist, Damian Vanderkruisen at the Mill, who's incredible and who's done most of my films. And he built us a LUT that, we shot tests for, and he built a few versions of it, but it's a very aggressive LUT, and in the sense that like, when you put it on the camera, everything looks completely different than what you see to your eye. And I think that's really important, because what happens is the costume designer sees this, the production designer sees this, even the actors see, the director, everyone sees it. And so that when I'm pointing a certain direction, what normally would look okay looks incredible. Or if I point this way, I'm like, oh, that actually doesn't look good because there's a lot of blue in this frame. We're not really using blue, and it doesn't really register well within our palette. Yeah. So it's kind of like putting on, rose-colored glasses and knowing what looks good and what doesn't look good. And I think that's really crucial to the look.
Right. You mentioned the rose. Can you talk about other characteristics of this aggressive look that were part of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a saturation. It was really embracing reds, golds, and weirdly green. Green became like a very strong color in the film, which was not something we anticipated at all. But it was, that winter in San Francisco they had received like a ton of rain, and then it was beautiful for like the entire 5 weeks of shooting. So that it was just such a lush city at that point. Yeah. And then Damien also, worked a lot of magic into the LUT in terms of like sort of the gamma and the curve of it. So like the blacks are fairly dense, but they're lifted, so it has this sort of like film printy feel, which I love. And he really pulls the highlights down so that you get a lot of detail in the skies, you get all the clouds and everything. But there's still a lot of contrast in it somehow. So it's this very punchy, poppy, saturated look that still has this softness in the high and low ends, which I really love. And it's very filmic in a lot of ways. Yeah. But at the same time, it's not, I don't know. I feel like I hit a new stride with that film in terms of digital work, where I was really happy with the way digital looked. And it was like the first time I really felt like super strongly about it. And it got to the point where, we were doing the color session, which we only had 5 days to do the entire film, which is kind of nuts for a feature film. But by the end, we'd always planned on doing like a film grain overlay on it to kind of take the edge off of the digitalness of it. But we decided not to at the end of it, because we just liked it. We just thought it looked really good and it looked really unique. We felt like putting digital, like affecting it with film grain would just feel kind of forced and fake, And so that felt really good. It felt really good to get to that point and say, we don't need to put some artifice, some like artifice over what we already have. And I think also having that LUT does something really interesting where it like softens the image in a weird way. And we shot with master primes, which are really sharp. And shooting with master primes is a really integral part of the look of the film, because you have that like really fast roll off in the focus. Yeah. But having that like sharp photographic kind of lens with a softer LUT really I think worked well.
Yeah, definitely. I want to ask you about the bedroom, Mont's bedroom. You had those two par cans, which really gave you that kind of that spotty warmth in that space where you wouldn't normally expect to maintain that. Was that something that came from you or from the designer?
Are you talking about like when they're laying on the bed and they're spotlight? Yeah. The designer had the lights, but I think the idea for the spotlight was Joe and I together. And it was something I was kind of playing around with, and I think I set it up just to look at it, and I assumed it was going to be too aggressive and too dramatic. But but I had the actors lay down and I was going to put some diffusion over the lights, and Joe was like, that looks amazing, let's shoot.
Nice.
You know, it's one of those things where I was like, I don't know if this is right. I don't know if I should be doing this. I don't totally feel great about it, but we just kind of went for it. And, you know, and that was the thing, is like Joe constantly was pushing, and like, he also knew what he wanted, and he knew what he liked. And I really like that really like, that instilled a lot of confidence in me to take those risks. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, that was, I mean, completely unique. I've never seen that for like a practical kind of a unit. I want to switch over to Euphoria now. There was a question here that somebody asked, I think is a good transition question, of what it was like for you to go from features into series as a DP, and what were some specific challenges and how you handled them. And guys, if you want to just hold, or if you can press the question button on the bottom to ask them there rather than in the comments, we'll get to those later.
Yeah, I mean, I had never worked in television before. And this was, Euphoria is like, in a lot of ways, the opposite end of the spectrum from Last Black Man, both like technically and creatively in a lot of ways.
Yeah, there we go.
So it was a challenge for sure. I think it was super exciting. And I really loved working on Euphoria. I loved being able to come in and do a couple episodes. And it was a bit intimidating because of what had been done before me. And also the idea of coming into something that's already been pre-established, you know, was, from an ego standpoint, also challenging. I think, you know, like that's another thing as DPs that we struggle with, is our ego. And it's understandable. And, you know, we're artists and we have a specific vision of how things should be. So, you know, I was reassured going into it because I had spoken a lot with Sam, the director, writer, producer. And Sam was constantly asking me what they could do better, how we could elevate the show. And like right from that moment when he started asking me those questions, which kind of took me off guard. You know, I came into the meeting kind of wondering how I was going to impress him and how I was going to convince him. Whereas for him, he was just looking for new ideas and new directions to take the show and new ways to elevate it. So that was really exciting and like very flattering, and gave me a lot of confidence to just go in and do something of my own, you know. And I think it was important to honor what had been done before me, but I could also like sort of instill my own flavor into it. And I think from just like a technical standpoint, what's challenging about it was that we shot for way longer. You know, we shot for months. We had way more time, which is great, but also you have to be thinking much further in advance. You know, our lighting setups were much bigger, so I had to put in orders for things way ahead of time, and I sometimes had to just kind of guess and be like, I guess it's this amount of, you know, I guess I want this, I want that, and then just like go for it. Whereas with Last Black Man, I'm like, I have this little truck of lights, you know, and this is what I have, and I'm going to make it work. Whereas with Euphoria, it was like, what do you want? You know, just ask for it. So like that's almost more challenging. I think, you know, coming from the indie film world, I'm forced, you know, my entire career I was forced to work with what I was given and make it as best I could. And I really appreciated that. But going into a world where the world is at your fingertips is actually very intimidating in a lot of ways, because you could do so many different things. It's like, where do you draw the line, I guess? Yeah.
So how did you kind of go about thinking of how to make those you know, bold decisions where you did kind of push the boundaries, as Sam was saying? Because you know, one aspect of it is technically coming up with ideas that maybe you haven't experimented with. So what's that collaboration like with the operators and the key grip and the gaffer who have been on this show, assuming you know, they were consistent throughout?
Yeah, I mean, it was a huge part of it was Sam. You know, he really gave me the confidence to just go for it. He really pushed me, you know, to just always make the strongest, most interesting decision. And I really leaned on my crew. I leaned on my gaffer, Danny Durr, Mike Egrip, Jeff Kunkel, who are incredible. You know, I really hit like an amazing stride with my crew where I was no longer asking for specific tools, but I was just explaining like my conceptual vision. And that's sort of the dream. And that's not something I'm particularly used to, because I'm used to being in situations where I don't know the crew as well, or they may not be as experienced, or we may not have the resources, but I could just be like, I want to move the camera from here to there, and I don't know how to do it. And Jeff, our key grip, is like, well, we need a cable cam, and we need someone to come and, you know, install it the day before, and it'll be ready when you show up. It's like things like that that are amazing. It's really like, I felt very spoiled. And then just conceptually, it was, you know, it was kind of terrifying, because I feel like I would often, you know, I would light a set and Sam would walk in and he would walk around and look and be very quiet and kind of nod his head, and then like very politely, and then be like, how can we make this better? You know? And it was like, at first it was like a shot in my heart. I was like, I fucked up. I'm not good enough, you know? And then I realized that no matter how good I was and how much I pushed it, he would always ask that question. And it was almost like a test, you know? And it was really, it became like kind of this fun, like dance of, you know, him pushing me pushing back a little bit, you know, us working together. But again, it was that really like respectful, tactful way of like trying to elevate each other's work, you know?
Right.
And what was great is that Sam would listen, and, you know, when I responded, and I would have ideas about blocking or like performance things, and he would listen very intently. And it was a very like familial vibe, which was really cool.
Yeah. You talked a little bit about the DP ego, and you know, when you're speaking with your team about, you know, this is something that I want to achieve, but I don't know how to do it. That sense of vulnerability, was there? How did you kind of move past that sense and go toward just like, all right, let me just have an open dialogue with them, and they'll have the confidence in me to be the leader?
I think what it came down to was just knowing that I needed to understand conceptually what needed to happen in each scene, and that my crew knew how to, you know, execute it technically.
Right.
And I think, you know, they were more used to it, because there have been a few DPs already rotated through, and obviously like other directors. And so I think for them, like that television dynamic was a little more natural for them. Whereas for me, it was very foreign. But yeah, I think it's just about showing confidence and showing respect, you know, and it's not about like, you know, I was very open about when I knew how to accomplish something versus when I didn't know how to accomplish something.
Yeah.
And I started to learn that there are better ways to do what I do, or sometimes the way I did them was actually maybe a little bit faster, a little bit more interesting. So it's always that give and take. And I think it's all, again, about respect and trust.
Yeah. What was the collaboration and conversations like with the DPs who came before you on Euphoria?
Pretty much no conversation.
Really?
My friend, I didn't really chat with Marcel, who started the show. I think he was on another project out of the country. I spoke a bit with Drew Daniels, who's a good buddy of mine. But Drew was shooting the entire time and totally slammed. So I would like pop onto set and kind of look at what he was doing. But in general, I don't know. I tended to avoid it, honestly, because I think it made for something more interesting. I was really wary about coming in and just executing what had been done before me. And I knew that Sam had a lot of strong ideas, and that would kind of be a guiding light, you know?
Yeah.
So I just sort of went for it and didn't worry. I figured that the crew would have sort of an idea of the basic formula of how you show up and how you start to light something. And then I would kind of help finesse it a bit further. And it was a little bit wild because Sam, the director, was so busy working on the previous episodes, whether he was directing or writing or just doing production work or post work, that I actually had very little time with him in prep. We didn't shot list at all for my episodes, and we would just show up on set every day.
Wow.
And Wild West style, just make it up on the day, which was kind of insane.
For a show like that, it seems
totally terrifying. Yeah, I mean, some of our craziest shots that you've seen in my 2 episodes were made up on the day, completely.
Wow.
And it was all about just like having the tools there, ready, and a crew that was just incredible and could help us execute it. And then Also very patient actors who were, I mean, our cast was so amazing and beautiful and lovely and so patient with us to the point where, you know, we're doing these like insane moves that are really camera specific, and the actors, all they're doing in the scene is walking, you know,
Yeah.
and they were so patient to just be like, okay, the camera's going to spin around you 3 times and then go above you, but all you're doing is walking into a club, you know. So they were, and like we'd have to do 20 takes of it. And so it was really, you know, we were lucky to have a cast that was so patient with us.
Yeah. You know, obviously what you guys have created in Euphoria is like a complete embodiment of the word, and in every level, with camera, lighting, with even the choice of majority Alexa 65. You mixed a little bit. You had some scenes that were 16. So can you talk about the decision to bring that in?
Yeah, we shot. So we actually started shooting a lot of stuff on 35 early
Okay.
on. Sam originally wanted to shoot the entire show on film, but HBO pushed back, and so they ended up shooting Alexa 65. And I think by the time I was on set, they had been shooting for like 8 months, and Sam had really worn the production down in an amazing way, where we were kind of able to do whatever we wanted. And you know, we would come up with excuses to shoot on film, like, oh, this is a dream sequence, or this is a flashback, or this is an alternate reality. And then it got to the point where we would just always have the film cameras on set and have film. And we just have certain scenes where Sam and I would look at each other and be like, this would look better on film. Let's shoot it on film. And so we started shooting on 35 for a lot of scenes that were, some of them were specifically because we wanted them on film, and others were kind of spur of the moment. And we started getting the dailies back, and we were looking at them and we were like, this looks too clean. It looks too good. And so like very quickly we decided to stop shooting 35 and just start shooting 16. And that was right when Ektachrome was first coming out. And I pushed to shoot some Ektachrome. We ended up shooting a bunch of Ektachrome that didn't make it in, which is kind of a bummer. But I loved the way the 16 millimeter stuff cut with Alexa. And I think especially when you get a really good scan of 16 millimeter and a really good grade, it just like it sings, you know. And
Yeah,
some of, I think,
absolutely.
some of people's favorite scenes are on 16 millimeter, and I think it's because it's on 16 millimeter. I think that's
Yeah.
a big impressive you know, impact that it has.
The investigative scene, or the sequence that Rue goes on, that seemed to be all 16. What was the, or at least most of it was, what was the decision to go with 16 for that?
Sam had this reference of this TV show from the 90s. I can't remember what it's called, but it was like a detective. It was like a, you know, like a CSI style show that was made in the 90s. And it was all shot on film on 16. And it's like kind of campy and kind of schlocky,
Right.
but it works really well. It cuts really well. You know, like they would cover a scene a million different times handheld, and like, you know, at random points, just like cut 3 times for no reason, you know,
Okay.
just to like kind of like mix it up and keep it
Right.
fresh. And so Sam kept showing me these episodes, and it's like, it's hilarious, but you're also realizing that it works really well. And so we just kind of actually we tried to embrace that style. And so we did a lot of like 16 handheld and a lot of like fast dolly moves. But, you know, the whole construct of the detective is, you know, Rue's character going insane and becoming manic. And so we just wanted to create a whole nother headspace for her when she was in that world. And so shooting on 16 really helped us do that.
Right. For the rest of the show with you know, whatever was on 65, can you talk about the format and that sensor size, and how it contributed to you know, the themes and the feeling you wanted to create, and also in combination with depth of field?
Yeah, sure. I mean, shooting on the Alexa 65 is amazing. It's a really incredible camera. And the lenses that we were using were also really beautiful. Marcel had early on sort of picked out this one lens. It was a 65 millimeter lens, the DNA Prime. And the thing with those lenses is that they're very inconsistent, those lens sets, because partially because they're new and because Aries is trying to like pump them out as fast as possible. And a lot of them are old rehoused glass. So there's not a lot of consistency between the sets. So Sam and Marcel decided pretty early on to only shoot with basically one lens. So and that worked really well for me. I love doing that, as I stated before in Last Black Man. So almost the entire show was shot on a 65 millimeter lens.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if we ever changed lenses. There might be like 2 or 3 shots in my episodes that we shot with different lenses, but
Okay.
and I think that lens is really interesting because it's that perfect focal length where you can be in a situation and still get wide enough that you can get kind of a wide shot, and the wide shots feel very like there's still like really dramatic focus fall off in a wide shot, but then you can also get these like incredible close focus close ups, and you very rarely have to use a diopter. So the 65 millimeter was in that really great sweet spot, and having that shallow depth of field just elevated everything. And I think the show was all about this very, very impressionistic, subjective human experience. And I think that's really important, is that like the show is never objective. We're never watching these people go through something. We're going through it with them. And that's super important. I think it's the ground that we covered in the show is very familiar to a lot of people. And it's not like groundbreaking in that way. I think what's groundbreaking is how it was, written and directed and captured. That was very visceral. It's very intimate. It's very, it's very human. And I think having that one lens was also a way to like keep the vision consistent and keep the voice consistent in a way. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Can we talk about some of your lighting setups? Obviously, one of the clips that I posted was the one of Rue and Jules biking through the woods, and I saw some of your your BTS stories where I think you mentioned there were you had a couple balloons and like, I don't know, 30 plus lights or something. So how did you kind of go about that? And obviously with the moonlight too, you have a visible source that is harsh, stronger than the sun. I mean, so what was the thought process behind that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general with the lighting, it was very impressionistic and very subjective for the entire show. And it goes back to this idea of it being very maximalist. And I could like totally get on board with that, because when I was a teenager and when I was in high school, the world just looks like that in my head. It was like the world is so cinematic when you're a teenager, and every situation is life and death. It's just like the highs and lows of being a teenager are so extreme. And I think that approach was really important. So when that came to lighting, it was just like, what can we do to make this as like extra as possible at all times, which is so it kind of goes against a lot of my sort of like ethics about filmmaking. But my strongest ethic about filmmaking is to follow the voice of the filmmaker who's like leading it. And that was Sam. And I believed in Sam, and I believed what he was doing was like the right way to be doing things. And he pushed me to do that. And so, for example, the girls biking through this orange grove that you see throughout the show, I think it was like the first time you saw it at night. That could have been, if that was another movie, it could have been, one balloon light or one softbox overhead of the orange grove, with some soft moonlight cascading down, and very natural, very kind of like elegant. But, that's not Euphoria. Euphoria is 2 balloon lights overhead to give some base ambience, but then you have literally 50 2K blondes in a line, backlighting them, that you're kind of going through the orange groves. Like, why are they there? I don't know. Like, why would there be 50 lights back there? You don't really know, but it's just like, it gives the right feeling. And then we had a condor on either end of the orange grove back, either, we would pan one away. Depending on which direction we were shooting, we were always using it as backlight. So like we would pan it off if we weren't looking towards it, and we'd pan it on if we were looking towards it. I'm trying to think if there was anything else that we had for that. But no, it was the 2 big balloon lights, probably about 52 Ks in the trees, kind of backlighting through smoke. And then the 2 big HMIs on the condors. And smoke was always atmosphere was always a big part of catching the light. And one thing that's cool is like, you actually see that location earlier in the series. I think it's in the pilot actually. Marcel shot, and he shot that orange field, and it looks so cool when he shot it, but it looks completely different. He spotlit Jules as she's riding her bike. It's like there's a shot of following her riding her bike through the orange trees, and there's just a light on top of the, whatever vehicle they were using. It's just pinging her. And I think that's brilliant in its own way. And that's totally inconsistent with what I did, but it captures more the feeling of what, these people are going through. It's awesome.
Right. I guess our backgrounds are similar color walls. So this guy's asking if it's a really poetic, romantic, surreal experience that you guys created. And there's such a blend of